Welcome to Vision to Value, the podcast that pulls back the curtain on how technology is planned, purchased, and implemented in state government health and human services agencies. Each episode explores the real challenges of transformation, from procurement pitfalls to leadership strategies, and provides bold insights to drive meaningful change. Your hosts, Carole, Hussey, and Tony Mathews, bring decades of experience from both public and private sector leadership. Together, Carole and Tony bring unfiltered insights and straight talk on what works, what doesn't, and how agencies and vendors can turn vision into real value. Now let's get started. Join us in a warm welcome to this week's guest. We are honored to host Wayne Glaus, a health and human services industry professional focused on driving transformation and modernization in the public sector. Most recently, Wayne was a Principal Director of Transformation and Strategy Consulting with Accenture. Prior to that, he served as the Chief Information Officer for the Tennessee Department of Human Services. Let's get into it.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Vision to Value. As you can see, we have a special guest with us today. We threatened that last week. We're going to be talking today about the leadership blueprint for transformation. And so we have a very special guest with us today, Wayne Glaus, former CIO of several agencies in Tennessee. And he's a leader who has firsthand experience bridging that gap between business and technology to drive meaningful change. And he is also a former coworker of Tony's. And so we thought it'd be great to bring them together today to talk about, how they work together and what that leadership, structure looked like for them and their style. Wayne, do you want to give a brief introduction for yourself before we get started?
Yeah, thank you. As you noted, I was CIO for two of the agencies in Tennessee and worked with Tony at Department of Human Services, where we did a very major transformation initiative across all the divisions within the agency. So we do have actually quite a bit to talk about.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Yeah, we do. We're going to cover a little bit about why leadership is so essential for transformation projects, what happens when leadership is missing or weak, and how to lead effectively in public sector technology modernization. So we're going to dive right in. And first, let's talk a little bit about why leadership matters. So Wayne, let's start with you since you're our guest today, and talk a little bit about transformational projects not being IT projects. Tony and I say that all the time. They're business projects. So what does that mean to you as a CIO?
So what it means is that technology is effectively a tool, and it's one tool in your toolbox to solve or address challenges, problems, or issues that you face running a business or an agency. Sometimes it's appropriate, sometimes it's not. Leadership is what determines what the right solution to the right problem is, which presupposes leadership has framed the problem correctly. But assuming that that's taken place, the choice from leadership is this a technology addressable problem or not? And if it is, then the CIO is responsible to help find the right technology-based solution to help address the problem. If it's not a technology addressable solution, then the CIO needs to work with the COO, agency leadership, whatever the case may be, to figure out what might be the right set of solutions to address the problem.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah. And it's true. Sometimes there's not a technology solution. Sometimes it could be a change in practice or process, right? And so I'm sure, Tony, that you could appreciate that type of collaboration and accountability on the part of your CIO partner as a business person. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, hearing from a CIO, it's not an IT solution, must be refreshing in some regards, right?
It is. And I kind of want to back up a step too. Before Wayne joined state government as CIO, he was pretty established and accomplished as a private sector CIO. So, and that was one of the values, I think, in bringing him into state government was, he was willing to come into state government and we could leverage some of that real world practical business experience that he had. Mm-hmm. I think the other piece too that he's too humble to admit too is the quality he has as a CIO to be able to translate some very complicated technical concepts from an IT standpoint and sort of translate that to leadership and to the sort of program staff that needed to leverage that technology and the other way, right? He could also listen to program, hear what they said their problem was, diagnose whether it was personnel related, whether it was process related, and then figure out whether there was a technological solution to it, and then translate that to his technical folks in a way that they could understand it. So while yes, you need strong leadership, I think part of that is making sure you've got people that are humble enough and well versed enough that they can speak sort of both sides of that fence.
Yeah. That's a unique talent too, right? Like not everyone has the ability to do that. And when we think about somebody with that type of ability, they usually have this inherent ability to influence change, right? And so when we talk about transformation, there's a whole lot of change that's happening. Wayne, can you talk about leadership and influencing change across, up and down, outside of your organization when it comes to transformation?
Yeah, so as you rightfully point out, the change management aspect of transformation, basically any project, but especially a large transformational project, is the tipping point of success versus failure. That's really all there is. The rest of it comes and goes, and it's there or it's not. But the change management and understanding the level of change that's going to be required, and then the willingness to actually lead through that change after it's defined, that's really the special sauce or the secret sauce that gets the thing done or not. So early on, the leadership team needs to be having active discussions around how big of a change is this? Where? What are the implications to the staff, to policy, to budget? All of those things need to be talked through before you lift the first finger towards actually trying to transform, because you need to do a lot of groundwork. And this all comes from leadership on, we're changing, here's why. Here's where we want to end up after the change. Here's what that looks like. Here are some examples of what that looks like. The more clarity you can provide before you start the change, A, the better it's communicated in terms of impact and understanding. But B, it gives people an idea of where you're going, why you're going there, and what you need to look like when you actually get there.
No, that's all true. Yeah, go ahead,
Carole,
Tony.
communication's a big part of that, right? Like one of the lessons that we learned when we did it, we started out, it was a modernization effort. And so the communication from the top of the organization was about modernization. And then as we started to pull in some of the program folks and realized that, job descriptions were going to have to be amended, processes were going to have to be changed, the whole, a lot of OCM, right? We realized it was a transformation project, not just a modernization. And once we started getting those buzzwords sort of into our vernacular, then the leadership started talking about the transformation, and that helped people sort of understand this is more than just new technological tools. This is changing the way you run your organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And when I hear both of you talk, the thing that sort of resonates for me is it feels like there was a lot of trust there, right? Like when I've worked in a lot of states, and sometimes there's a lot of friction between the IT department and the business, right? The program. And so, Wayne, how do you work with business leaders like Tony on the program side of the house, so that you're positioned as that trusted strategic partner? We talk about this relative to the vendor community, but it's the same thing, right? Between your IT and your program teams, how did you become that strategic and trusted enabler for him?
So some of that is based on prior experience and what you've learned in other situations and what you can bring to bear in this situation. But a lot of it is going to be learning the language, learning the dynamics, learning how the leadership team functions and how you fit in with that. What's the best way to integrate yourself into that existing leadership team? Because in my case, they were all there. They weren't there for years and years, but they were still there before me. So being the newcomer, I had to basically figure out, and it's really important to speak the same language. So that I spent a lot of time listening and understanding what terms meant, the context, and when people would say things, because any new environment you go into, things get rattled off in a nanosecond that you understand maybe one of 15 words. So there's a lot of behind the scenes, what does this mean? And then also just watching the dynamic and figuring out how to best fit in with that dynamic, but be able to push it when it needs to be pushed. Because part of the reason you have multiple people in the leadership team is not everybody pushes the same amount on the same day all the time. And that's a really important talent to learn as a leadership group is there are days when Tony pushed harder than the rest of us. There were days when I pushed harder, and there were days when the commissioner pushed harder. And that was for circumstantial and environmental reasons, and we had to learn that dynamic. But that was a really important thing to know that while we each pushed individually, we all had the same answer to the same question in different environments. So you got that consistency, but you were really truly able to leverage the individuals and the leverage in the leadership team to their best advantage, which is a rare thing to find, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And it sounds like, that investment that you made in learning the program and understanding that really helped to develop, that trust that allowed you to push, right?
That's right.
Certainly your credibility that you had from previous experience was great, but then that enabled you to build that trust level as well, that you were committed and you all had the same sort of vision.
That's right. And that has to be crystal clear every hour of the day until such time as you are a bit more established. But even then it becomes in some ways more important because the pressure goes up, right? When you're the new person in, people don't know what to expect. So you're making an impression. As you've made that impression, now results matter. And what you say lining up to what you do and what you deliver matters the most. So I spent a lot of time making sure that the things that I identified for my crew to work on were important things and they would make a difference. And then we got them done as quickly as possible so that A, they weren't holding us back from the bigger transformation efforts, but B, people started to generate trust, not just in me, but in my team as a whole. That was incredibly important that they trusted the team, not just me, because me alone, I'm not going to do anything. I need not only the leadership partners, but I need my crew to follow along and be able to be in line with where we've defined we're going to go and how we're going to get there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and all of those things then gave you credibility within your own team with your staff. So I can see,
Right.
the managing up and down on both sides of that.
That's right.
Let's pivot a bit into talking about what happens without strong leadership. I mean, we talk about leadership a lot in this podcast, and so and we've talked about what it means to be a leader. So let's assume, people don't have that camaraderie between IT and program or whatnot, or other things are missing. What happens without that, Tony? We'll start with you.
Well, when I was working in the private sector, you see this, right, with projects that would fail. A lot of times, if you didn't have sort of engaged sponsorship from your chief executive, then you didn't, the dominoes that needed to fall to line everything up wouldn't happen. A good example is you need the subject matter experts on the business side, right, in the program areas to weigh in with the IT folks to make sure that we're working hand in hand and things are tracking and the testing is being done and all of those things, understanding the lift that's going to be required. If you don't have a chief executive that's engaged to know that they're going to have to potentially give some grace to performance measures, right, to those folks that have a day job, instead of a 90%, 2-minute turnaround time on incoming requests, maybe we're going to suspend that for a quarter, and it's only 80% that have to be within a certain time period, because we know that we're asking you to do this other thing off the side of your desk, and we can't hold you to the same performance standards and have you do both well. So I think that's one way where it fails is you don't have that. The chief executive doesn't understand what the need is for the transformation. They can't explain it to the people that they're speaking to, whether it's the legislature or the administration, and they can't give sort of the relief or the consideration they need to the staff to make sure that they're not burning out for a 3-year transformation, you could burn people out very easily by asking them to do two jobs at the same time. They're not going to do either one of them well. And I think that's where we see a lot of the failures in a lot of these implementations.
Yeah, we definitely need those folks to, make sure that the resources that are needed are there, and that any kind of roadblocks or barriers that come up are being addressed quickly, so that and that again, building credibility, building trust, right? And all the way around. What would you add to that, Wayne, in terms of, what happens without that leadership?
I think decision making becomes way less effective. And sometimes decisions don't get made when they need to be made, because particularly in something as big as a transformation, it's not so much about choosing what you are going to do as much as what you're not going to do. So as Tony mentioned, there are going to be times when the senior group of leaders are going to have to choose between, and it's not about you don't want to do something or it's not worth doing, but there's only so many hours or so much bandwidth. You need to choose to do the things that are ultimately going to propel you towards those transformational goals. And as Tony rightfully pointed out, occasionally that sacrifices some short-term or tactical things, but that's what leadership is there to do, is to help reinforce those decisions when they need to be made, because timing is also everything. You can talk about budgets and you can talk about staffing and all that. There's always more of that at some point. There's never more time. And one of the huge price tags of not making the right decisions at the right time is you waste time that you don't ever get back. And then you're scrambling. And if it happens too frequently, then anything you planned is now suddenly at risk, if not off the rails altogether. So to me, decision making is a huge aspect of engaged and informed leadership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you talk about engagement, we talked about this in a previous episode as well. One of the projects I worked on in my career was during the Medicaid, the clearinghouses, and all of the things we were working on under Obamacare and everything. And it was interesting because one of the projects, the commissioner was in the meetings every single week. And I'd never seen that level of engagement or leadership on any project in my life. Now, granted, this was a big deal, right? Because the healthcare exchanges were being stood up, and we needed to make sure that everything was on track every week so that we could hit that date to stand up the exchange. And so to see her really take that level of involvement, it was unusual, but it also, I think, led to the success of being able to turn that switch on the day that we were dictated we had to do it, and it worked, right? Because of those decision-making things that happen every single day, we weren't waiting 3 or 4 weeks to the next steering committee meeting, right? So when we talk about engagement, it really is sometimes rolling up your sleeves and getting very much in the weeds.
Yeah, there's engagement that doesn't have to be seen, that can be behind the scenes but still effective. But then there's engagement that needs to be seen as engagement. And I think that's sort of the point you're making. And that's what we tried to do as well, was make sure that when the commissioner or Tony or I or anybody else needed to be seen as engaged, actively engaged, and driving the same agenda, we saw to it that happened, because that's more important than it sounds when you're just talking about it, when you're in the heat of the battle of 2,500 to 4,000 people watching you to determine if you believe this is going to work or not. Every little thing you do matters in that equation.
It does. It definitely.
Yeah, and we mentioned this, as we were getting ready for this episode too. We had a monthly business and technology meeting that the commissioner attended every single month, which I think was critical, not only for engagement and understanding what we were doing and why and what the obstacles were, but the visual of seeing that this was important to the top of the organization.
Yeah.
And then the other part of that was, Wayne had sort of each program area, instead of the reporting being done by the technology people about what was going on in each division had to report out in that monthly meeting what was going on how they were tracking, what their obstacles were, if they were ahead or behind schedule, what they needed in order to get on schedule and make everything work correctly and well. And the commissioner was there. So if you weren't prepared, if you weren't, drinking the Kool-Aid, if you were sort of putting up barriers that didn't need to exist, it was in front of all of your peers and the commissioner. And occasionally, she would have to lay down the law and say, we're not asking, if this could be done by the end of the year. This will be done by the end of the year. Tell me what you need in order to make that work. Mm-hmm. And so I think that was the other part of it, was that not just the visual, not just the understanding, the knowledgeable engagement, but also just the accountability that kind of engagement brings with it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Well, so we promised a leadership playbook, right? We're going to tell folks what they got to do today. So let's talk about how to lead effectively. Tony, what are the, if you had to pick a few things to advise in terms of a leadership playbook, what are the things that you would recommend that leaders do to be successful?
Well, I think part of it starts with the coordination and cooperation among the different leaders. You've got a technological lead in the CIO, you've got an operational lead, a COO, you've got the executive leader. They have to be like parents in such that they've got to be singing out the same sheet of music. And when there's pushback, you say, well, let me check in with Wayne and see why he's explaining it that way. And a lot of times we'd find out that there was something that wasn't being communicated clearly. We just had to clarify it. So I definitely think that the leadership triumvirate, or however many people you have leading it, have to be in lockstep with each other and have to support each other, where you can, like a parent would, you can't let them play you against each other, or you're not going to make the traction you need to. I think the other single biggest thing to me is communication. If people understand the why you're doing something, they may or may not agree with it, but they're more likely to go along with it if they understand that there was a reasoning to it. You did consider these other things, and you excluded them for whatever reasons you did. That's easier to accept, that it was a conscientious, thoughtful decision that you came to, and maybe you didn't have all the information when you thought it was a bad idea. But now that you understand the why, it's easier to sort of go along with it. So definitely cooperation among leaders and the way you're communicating.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like a clear vision, right? And that alignment, that strategic alignment with all the various stakeholders, even your users, to your point. Yeah. Wayne, what would you add to that?
I think in addition to those things, you got to want it. The leadership team really has to want it and be serious about, again, transformation is a many-headed beast, and there's a lot to consider and a lot to say yes to. So if there's not clarity around what you're saying yes to, get some outside advice to educate yourself on, here are all the things you just said yes to when you said we want to transform. Because it's never as easy as one word. And in our case, we actually took the bigger leadership team off site for 2 days with an outside partner and talked about those things to sort of drive that clarity around, this is what this is going to mean. This is what this is going to take. This is how you need to think about it. This is how you can talk about it. So if you got to really want it, and if that means getting help from professionals on how to consider it and what your role needs to look like, by all means do that. There is no investment that's too large to help inform leadership on how to lead in something like this. Because while there's a lot of ways to do it, there's no single way that's the right way. It depends on the circumstances, the business you're in, the needs you're trying to address, and the individual. So you have to take all that into account and come up with the right set of magic to make that work. So it's about informing yourself, talking a lot, communication, collaboration, coordination. Those three things are key.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and go ahead, Tony.
No, I just say, to piggyback on that, we talked about this in a previous episode. When you're selecting vendors that you're going to bring in to provide that sort of expertise that you don't have in-house, I do think it's critical to find vendors that are willing to work as partners and not just hired guns that are going to do what you say, even though they know it's wrong. And I know we've talked about this before, but you've got to have, your state, your entity you don't know what the national best practices are. You don't know that a state in the Northwest crashed and burned last year doing it exactly the way you think you want to do it. But your partners, hopefully your vendor partners will, and they will have seen what hasn't worked. And you need to be able to leverage that, right? I mean, that's part of what you're buying is that sort of expertise. If you've got partners or if you've got, vendors that are just operating as vendors and they're not willing and they're not in it with you as a partner to sort of warn you when you're making a mistake, I think that's another sort of piece of the puzzle that you got to factor in.
Which means, though, you have to be vulnerable. You have to ask. You have to be willing to expose yourself to, we don't have all the answers, so we're going to ask you questions. But I think to Tony's point, when you're doing the initial selection and then subsequent contracting of your partners, make sure somebody has those conversations so that when it comes time to do that, you've laid the groundwork for, yeah, we're going to ask you about these things because this is what we think. But if we're wrong, we need you to fact check us or give us at least the reasons why you don't think it's a good idea so that you have those conversations before you get too far down the path. And recovery is lengthy, expensive, and demoralizing. So you want to avoid all those if you can. But in state government particularly, that means exposing a vulnerability that is not common in state government, at least in my experience. But you have to be willing to go there to be able to get help from your partners.
Yeah. And I like the idea of inviting that, right? Being vulnerable, inviting that honest feedback. And also, I'll say this, I think sometimes you have to have that third party objective partner who's working with you on that, because the partners, you might have a great SI partner, and I would never say they're not going to be that for you, but sometimes you're both so in it that having an advisor, that's kind of on the sideline saying, wait a minute, time out, like, let's talk about that, or let's, look at potential unintended consequences or whatever. So having that objectivity is also key to delivering that type of feedback to you that might inform different types of decision making as well.
I agree. And again, this is one of those intentional things you need to do up front, because to your point exactly, you are going to hire partners who are generally specialists in things.
Yeah.
What you really also need is a strategy or a generalist partner that you can just say, okay, this is what we were thinking. Give me some feedback or give me some options or give me something back that we can kick this around and make sure that we talk it through so that when I go to direct the other partners who are in fact specialists, there's something other than just my gut telling me to do that, right? So I think having a lot of partners is a good thing, but you still need to have an independent thinking partner that you can use to bounce ideas, approaches, concerns over that aren't directly tied to the work that you've contracted these other partners for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you were one of the first states that had a really, what some would believe to be a complex vendor structure with multiple vendors doing different things. And managing that is not always easy. That's hard. But you did that because you needed that structure in order to be successful.
You're exactly right. And also because we wanted to pick the right partner for the right piece of work.
Yeah.
So we were not going to get one size that would fit all, because that's an impossibility. And thankfully in the private sector, I'd seen that before and how it didn't work. So we very intentionally picked specific partners based on what they were good at. But we also made sure to have partners that weren't tied to that work, as I said, so that Tony or I or the commissioner could go to them and say, okay, this is what we're hearing, or this is what we're seeing. What do you think?
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of a reasonability check, if you will, because the partners are going to do what they've always done. That's what they do. Sometimes that's okay. Sometimes you need to push them for, I hear you, but what we need is slightly different. And that's what we're going to have to figure out a way to get.
Yeah.
And I think part of what feeds into that is understanding that that's going to be a heavier lift on the front end with procurement. I understand, and we've seen all these monolithic, we're going to hire one vendor that's going to do everything 100% well, and it takes forever and it never works out because there's no one size fits all. And they don't have the expertise in each little area, whether it's customer experience or, interconnectivity or a mobile application. Every SI can't do everything perfectly. And so you've got to know on the front end that we're going to have to do a lot more procurements, and we're going to have to be thoughtful about each one to make sure that we're getting this different expertise and that they all play nice in the sandbox together. And honestly, some states, some departments are, I don't want to say lazy. I think because they've got limited bandwidth, they take the easiest procurement vehicle that'll be the quickest. They'll dust off one they did 5 years ago and tweak it, and we'll use it for this. And then they find out down the road that we should have hired 3 or 4 different vendors that were experts in their field instead of trying to find one that could do everything like 70%.
Yeah, that rarely works. Well, let's kind of close it out here, Wayne. We were so thrilled to have you join us today. So could you give us just like some final parting words about leadership and the importance of leadership relative to transformation?
Yeah, so to steal one of Tony's sayings, leadership is like real estate: location, 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 leadership, leadership, leadership. It's the beginning and the end of everything. It determines success or failure on an hourly, daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, annual basis. And it needs to be engaged, it needs to be informed, and it needs to be willing to hear things it may not want to hear all the time, so that you are really informed with the 360 view, not just what people want you to hear. And that means sometimes you got to ask more questions. And I think what we tried to do often was not answer a question with a question, but if we needed to, ask 5 more questions before we answered that one question. And that's a level of engagement that takes more time, it takes more thought, and it takes understanding the situations, but it's so worth it. And in fact, I would hazard to say it is absolutely a mandatory requirement to make things like this work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. Any closing thoughts from you, Tony?
Yeah, I would just say that I think a big part of leadership and our secret sauce with the project that Wayne and I worked on was we didn't let perfect get in the way of good, which is an easy trap to fall into, because then you're never willing to pull the trigger. Nothing's ever good enough. We didn't do that, and our leadership team seemed to collectively understand that decision making is a commodity. Right. And at some point, you just need a decision, left or right. I mean, there's a fork in the road and we're going fast. We just need a decision. And, you make the best decision you can at the time you have to make it with the information that's available at the time. And I think a lot of projects fall short because so many folks are so committed to being perfect that they're not willing to make the best decision they can at the time that it's needed. And that derails a lot of projects. So I think that's another element of this leadership element, that the decision making is critical.
Yeah. The only thing I'll add is after you make said decision, you've got to be willing to change that decision if the facts point that out to you, which we were also willing to do. So we made decisions, but we were never in love with them to the point where they weren't revisited if they needed to be. And I think that's also an important thing, because you don't know everything. And if you learn more, sometimes the decision you made needs to be tweaked or modified because now you know more.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Well, I think we've left some folks with a lot of great points today. Not all of this is checklist sort of skills or actions. We talked a lot about things like culture and trust and credibility and things like that as well. So thank you so much, Wayne, for joining us and sharing your expertise with us today. And thank you to my partner, Tony, as always. Thanks to all of you for joining us again for our podcast. We're delighted that you're getting some value from this content. And drop a line, let us know what you think the biggest lessons learned are from leadership in your career. Feel free to comment on our YouTube channel or on LinkedIn. And we hope to see you again in a future episode of Vision to Value. Thank you.